All right. Good afternoon. How's it going? All right. It's good to see you. And the music stopped, so that means we have to start. My name is Colum Slevin, and I am the head of the experiences team at Oculus VR. And I work with developers and creators. My team and I work with developers and creators to help them tell stories in VR. And so I want to talk about storytelling. My own background is in film, production and post-production, TV, animation, games, you name it, all sorts of stuff, for the past 30 years. And for the past 3 years, I've been working in VR. So, as I mentioned, I want to talk about storytelling. It's my job, and it's my team's job. And more particularly, it's our job to really help and inspire creators to figure out how to redefine storytelling and find ways to connect audiences. And we believe that storytelling is fundamental to the human experience, but on a more tactical level, it's also vital to the growth and survival of the medium of VR as a creative platform. So, and I talked a lot about this last year and the year before and at F8 and at other conferences. So I want to talk about the state of play for storytelling right now, but I also want to talk about some new ingredients. I want to talk about chaos, disruption, and confusion, and how they're shaping the evolution of storytelling. And I recently heard the filmmaker Chris McQuarrie say something that I thought really hit home for me, where he said, chaos is the most important ingredient in the making of films, and if you do not welcome it, it will overwhelm you. And I think that's really true, and I think it's particularly true right now with the shape of things and the amount of change that's going on. So this is Janus, the Roman god of beginnings, gates, transitions, doorways, new starts. And someone recently sent me a really compelling lecture by the legendary filmmaker and editor Walter Murch. And he uses Janus as an example. And what he talks about is when you work in a craft that is a creative expression that's constantly driven by new evolutions in technology, you're always passing through new doorways. So one of Janus's faces towards the future, and his other face looks back towards the past. And I thought this was germane and appropriate, given the theme of the Oculus 5 conference, and a lot of the stuff Hugo and Boz and others talked about this morning, which is that we are celebrating and acknowledging and thinking about the last 5 years and the progress we've made, but we're also looking towards the future and maintaining the momentum. So I think it's really important to keep the past in its appropriate context. And I want to talk about that tension. I want to talk about the tension between that and the undiscovered country of the future. So what do we mean by experiences when we talk about the work that we do? I like to define games, in my mind. I like to put them in a place which is about that they contain three key attributes: agency, mastery, and skill. And I think that sort of puts the development of games in a pretty clear framework. Experiences are this less crisply defined and very constantly evolving discipline. A hybrid discipline uses a lot of techniques from cinema, from improvisation, from live theater, and obviously also from interactive development, and in fact more and more so these days from interactive development. The goal is the evocation of empathy, the creation of a sense of immersion, and ultimately the expression of a story, the expression of a narrative to the user. So as I said, we care a lot about the evolution of VR as a storytelling medium on our team, but also, and in many ways more importantly, we care a great deal about making this medium a viable commercial reality for creators. So recently I was introduced to this experienced designer called Katie Newton, and she has this quote that I find extremely wise and beautifully encapsulates the struggle we deal with, where she says, as VR storytellers, We're charged with molding experience itself into a story, and our tools haven't necessarily prepared us fully for that. So as we stumble our way into this mysterious new medium, we ask ourselves, how do we tell a story for an audience when the audience is present within the story? That's sort of the nub of the whole thing. So we think a lot about, I certainly spend a lot of time thinking day to day when I talk to developers and talk to people that own franchises. We talk and think a lot about what we're making and how we're making it. And there were two things I wanted to mention about that as we dive in. And the first one is this. On the topic of what we create, I was really knocked sideways in the last year by a set of writing that was curated and largely written by Kamal Sinclair on makingnew-reality.org. And Kamal's the co-founder of the New Frontier Lab at Sundance and has an extraordinary voice when it comes to the responsibility we have as creators for the things we make. And specifically, she talks about at this moment in time, the importance of diversity, the importance of representation, the importance of designing for justice, designing for well-being, and for a relatively insular community like this, how to break echo chambers. And sort of to paraphrase her message, Kamal makes the point that this industry, speaking of looking to the past and thinking about what has gone before, this industry cannot afford to disregard inclusion as a principle and risk suffering the fate of traditional media that we all see playing out. Stakes are just too high. So I'm going to talk about some new elements that we find exciting but disruptive in the space. But the advent of these new elements into an already potent mix demands thoughtful application, I think, and for us to ask ourselves the question, what are we making and are we doing good in the world? So if you take nothing away from anything I say today, please read Kamal's writing on this website. I highly recommend it, and it's extraordinary stuff. Okay, so as far as how we make things go, I'm not a doctor, but this is a prescription. And this is a prescription I try to administer to myself and to others every day working in VR, and it's a grain of salt. So I recommend you take it daily when you're working in VR, because the dirty little secret about our industry is we're all making it up as we go along, right? Everyone working in VR is making it up as they go, which is terrifying, but also completely liberating. And I've talked in the past about, I really love this idea of a beginner's mind, and the idea that in a beginner's mind, it's a piece of Zen philosophy, and that's as deep as I go with it. But in a beginner's mind, there are infinite possibilities, and in an expert's mind, there are few. So we're at that juncture, and it's a lesson we learn time and time again that the most valuable takeaway I get on a daily basis is that a humble outlook is really, really important, because the more colloquial paraphrase of Master Yoda's quote here is that nobody actually knows anything, and don't believe them if they tell you they do, least of all me. So okay, everyone who works in VR has an origin story and has an entry point, a movie, a video game, a comic book, a book. And for me, it was this book. It was Neuromancer by William Gibson. My dad made a gift of it to me back in the 80s, because he's a sci-fi nut and he had discovered Gibson's writing. And I was, as is often the case for me, I was particularly seduced by the poetry of his language. That was my way in. And he uses this phrase, a consensual hallucination. And I loved that. I love the idea of an experience that human beings could have that was both hallucinatory and yet voluntary. And I thought that was a revolutionary idea, and I still do. But this was my starting point, for the record. We talked a lot today about our new platform with Oculus Quest and the idea of 6 degrees of freedom. And just to level set, I think most of us in this room who deal with VR know this, but when you're dealing with these fundamentally two different types of experiences in VR, 3 degrees of freedom, you are headlocked. You can yaw, pitch, and roll like an airplane. You can move left to right. forward and back and roll left to right, but you cannot move in Z depth within the experience. And then obviously 6 degrees of freedom. You have complete liberty to move around within the experience and interact. And it is usually what people have in mind when they talk about VR is this fully immersive experience. And 6 degrees of freedom right now, when it comes to narrative developers and designers, is very much where it's at for us. We have a range of headsets, both in the 3 degrees of freedom with the Samsung Gear VR and the Oculus Go, and all the way to 6DoF with Rift. And then this new category emerged this year where we launched the Oculus Go, the first standalone headset from Oculus, first all-in-one headset from Oculus with 3DoF, and then announced the Oculus Quest for spring of next year with full 6 degrees of freedom and hand presence. So, you know, and using the Insight system for inside-out tracking. So let's talk about what it means for developers and where we go from here. Excuse me. So we're 5 years in, and we're at this interesting juncture for, especially for narrative creation in VR, both as a business and an art form. On the one hand, there are signs of a tipping point in the artistry and the boldness and the innovation of the experiences that people are creating, but also in the growing acceptance of it as a meaningful storytelling platform with its own identity and integrity. But on the other hand, we're making this transition from a sideshow, which is a concept I'll expand upon, into the mainstream, and we need to evolve to make that change. The worst risk that faces us is that the medium remains mired in novelty, and that is something that we're committed to transcending, and something we're all working hard to move beyond. I think that VR has the potential to be the most revolutionary medium of our age, for the consumption of entertainment, for education, for brands, for everything. But and I swear to God, we did not exchange notes, because Mark used this morning in his talk. But this is a phrase that is used at Facebook a lot, that Oculus has really embraced and inherited. There's a cadence at the company that's all about momentum, and there's all about driving forward and moving forward. So I think it's also helpful to think about the fact that we are at the beginning. So the experiences team has a mission and vision statement, and this is it. We create VR experiences, redefine storytelling, and connect audiences in ways that they had not heretofore imagined. And I love this statement. My team and I, we co-authored it. We thought a lot about it, and it's a very useful razor to describe to people what we care about. But I think it's important to distinguish between a mission statement and the thing that actually gets you out of bed in the morning. And I want to show you what that is for me. So it's Chief Brody. So Chief Martin Brody from the movie Jaws, in this scene, is beset by stress, and he's got an issue with a savage animal on the beach. But he's also beset by this councilman who wants to talk to him about parking spaces. His wife Ellen wants him to chill out. And if we watch this clip for long enough, Harry with the swimming hat will show up and completely horrify us all. But hopefully we won't stick with it long enough, because he is spectacularly ugly. But the important thing is that something occurs, and then this happens. Okay, there's Harry. He's spectacular. Okay. So this is a dolly zoom, and it's a optical camera trick, and it's not the first or only one of its kind, and nor will it be the last. But it's one that had a real impact on me when I saw it. For me, this is like the perfect encapsulation, the perfect atomic example of art and science in the service of character and story. It dazzles you, but it also plays a really important role in the sense that this moment, this optical trick, puts you in the mind and the body of this character at this point in the story, and you understand what he is feeling. It's a heightened approximation of human sensation that is impossible in another medium. Like you can't do it in a book or in text or in another form. And the thing that excites me and makes me thrilled about the future is the idea of enabling creators to use our technology to create moments like this. You know, to create stories that contain moments that make people sit up in their seats and make the hair on the back of their neck stand on end. And that's what excites me most about VR, is that potential. So what that makes me think about is going back to the beginning. So I showed a similar chart to this last year for those of you who are repeat viewers, and I wanted to raise this point again. This is a timeline of the major technological events, or hardware launches mostly, that have occurred over the last 5 years. And it's very easy to be lulled into this sense that a lot has happened in a really short amount of time, and we've come a really long way. And in many ways we have. Both the hardware that's been launched as well as these seminal sort of lists of experiences that have been launched have really driven the art form along. But I think it's important to look at our achievement in the appropriate context, or in at least an interesting relative context. So when you look at this graph, this timeline, in the context of the 100-year evolution of the craft of cinema, you see something different. You see this. So we're in our infancy as a medium, and we're at the starting line and not the finish line. I think of two things when I look at the timeline that stretches back to the 1890s about cinema. One thing that occurs to me is, explicit in the list, is that every meaningful evolution in creative expression, like every special thing that launched, was driven in synergy with some kind of technological leap forward as well. And that's a cycle we're all familiar with. John Dykstra invented a camera on Empire Strikes Back to capture a specific scene. But the other thing, which is less explicit in the text and in the visual, is the fact that a language evolved over 100 years. The language of cinema is imprinted on all of us, whether we speak it verbally or not. We know what it means. We relate to movies in a very deep way that's almost at a cellular level. And that language has not evolved yet for VR. It's an emergent medium. It's an evolving vocabulary, and it's starting to build. And we'll talk about some of those building blocks. But it won't happen overnight, and it can't be. We can't snap our fingers and make it happen. It has to emerge through the collective creative expression of this community, of the development community. So let's talk about someone important. This is Edward Muybridge. He's a really fascinating guy for many reasons. I'm only going to talk about one of them today. He conducted, in the 1880s, he pioneered a series of groundbreaking studies of bodies in motion, animals and humans. And this is an example of one of them. He shot this test at a racetrack at the behest of Leland Stanford, who's the former governor of California. And the bet, or the experiment that Stanford was trying to resolve, was that a horse's hooves all left the ground at the same time when it was at full gallop, because apparently in the 1890s, when all people did was go to the track, that's what people would argue about. But what Muybridge did was he set up an array of cameras along the racetrack. Each camera was a single frame, was triggered by a thread as the horse ran by, and he developed each plate from each camera and strung them together in a sequence of images and played them back on a custom-made device he called a zoopraxiscope. It was really cool. And it's an example, a particularly technologically innovative example in comparison to others, of a type of photography and exhibition that emerged in the 1880s, 1890s. Here are other examples. So basically, a piece of film would be either a mundane slice of life, or a staged event, or just something happening in public life, maybe a public event. No sound, no story per se, and was usually displayed via either temporary storefront spaces or as literal sideshows for vaudeville performances. So these, and literally this is, first one is entitled "A Cat Falling Down." There's a cat falling down, a train arriving at a station, and who could forget the classic Fred Ott sneezing? And it's like 49 frames of a dude sneezing. So these were essentially the 19th century equivalent of a tech demo at a trade fair, right? And it reminds me a little bit of, I used to go to SIGGRAPH all the time and go to the Emerging Technologies exhibit. Did anyone ever do that? Right? And you would see something like, hey, I saw a mirror made out of steam. And I just made that up, but you'd see something and you go, that's cool, and totally pointless, but it's cool. And you'd be like, are you going to go to Best Buy and buy one of those things? No. But these were germs of ideas. So cool, pointless tech demos. It makes me think of something John Carmack said, which he's talking about the greatest risk we face as a medium. And he says the risk is that we coast on novelty and on the initial wonder of being something no one has ever seen before. And that's an intense hit, but it doesn't last very long. And his exhortation to us is that we start judging ourselves not on a curve, but in an absolute sense. That we have to start creating experiences for VR that are not just like, oh, wow, that's cool. Interesting. It has to be, I need to get one of these things, and I need it to be in my home, and I need to see these stories. I need to consume this experience. So what happened in the 1890s and beyond to turn film from a literal sideshow into the defining art form of the 20th century? I would argue that stories happened, right? I think that storytellers came along. George Millay, the Voyage to the Moon, G.A. Smith's Santa Claus movie, Edwin Porter's Great Train Robbery, more George Millay with the Conquest of the North Pole. So these storytellers came along and took this clunky prototype technology and used it to create an art form, and precipitated the explosion of cinema as a mass market entertainment phenomenon. And for me, this, if nothing else, this alone is the reason we need to escape the sideshow. Storytelling, and not novelty or dazzle, is what's going to drive us down the path to mass adoption, in my opinion. Haven't said that. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I come from a background of, I've worked in film, and I love film. So these metaphors that I've just talked to you about are very precious and dear to me, and they resonate for me. I think film and the evolution of film as a narrative craft has been an elegant and convenient metaphor for, a lot of us, a lot of the people in this room, a lot of us working in VR, for the growth of narrative VR since the beginning. But a series of new ingredients have started to come into play that I think changed that landscape quite a bit. And film starts to fall into a category that feels more like a rear view mirror to me. A relevant and important context, but not necessarily the perfect metaphor for what will evolve in the future. I think there are 4 ingredients. There may be more, and 2 of these could blend together. There's a bunch of different ways the permutations could work. But I want to talk to you about 4 ingredients that I think are material and how they're shifting things a little bit. And they are location-based entertainment. You'll hear a lot about it today and tomorrow at this conference. The advent of interactivity and agency as a fundamental building block in storytelling, as opposed to something you bolt on. Social behaviors that are tribal in nature, and all-in-one standalone headsets. So these are 4 relatively disparate factors and sort of technological moments that are connected. I want to talk about what connects them. I want to talk about why they're having a profound impact on the ecosystem for narrative creators. All right, so let's start with location-based experiences. So this encompasses everything from theme parks, arcades, entertainment destinations like a Dave & Buster's, even movie theaters. And movie theaters are expanding and morphing to become more interactive in their own right. But the teams I want to talk about in this category today have sort of set themselves apart by breaking out of the traditional expectation of what an arcade is and are creating elaborate, custom, bespoke, high-end, free-roaming experiences that have story at their core that a user or an audience member can consume without ever owning an in-home VR system. Companies like, this also isn't a new category. Companies like Walt Disney have been at the forefront of this type of innovation since their inception, since they invented and redefined the concept of a theme park, all the way up to, people have probably seen that video on Twitter recently of Michael Eisner in 1998 showing a very heavy VR headset showing the Aladdin experience. So it just so happens that we're at a moment in time where technology has suddenly enabled location-based creators to do amazing things. There are a range of different creators that we see emerging that are doing really great stuff. In the US, VR studios are in Washington, and other teams are in Amsterdam and as far away as Russia. For those who haven't tried it, I highly recommend you check out, if you can, the Secrets of the Empire experience by The Void, which is playing here in the Innovation Zone. So this is a really cool experience, and it's a lot of fun, and I highly recommend you try it. What strikes me as remarkable about what The Void and ILMX Lab have done with Secrets of the Empire is that it's a commitment. This is a unique canonical experience within the Star Wars universe. It's not a billboard for a movie. It's not a commercial for a TV show or for a game. It's its own thing, which feels to me very much like a first in VR, and it sort of signals the level of commitment that a company like Lucasfilm and Disney have to immersive entertainment. So, Secrets of the Empire is extraordinary. I recommend you check it out. Then there are teams like the Dreamscape guys who have created their own, a library and a series of their own IP. This is their Alien Zoo experience, which will begin coming out in more and more venues and are doing really, really beautiful stuff. The Nomadic guys in San Rafael, and who couldn't be at the conference today because they are jamming to ship their first experience, which is Arizona Sunshine in location-based VR. They're headquartered in San Rafael and going wide with the experiences they're building. Arizona Sunshine is really cool in LBE. And the Spaces team in, again, headquartered in LA, and their first experience with the Terminator Salvation LBE is in Irvine. So we've talked over the last year, a lot of people have talked about Carnier Arena as well. And this belongs in this category very much for me. It is just at a different end of the spectrum. ILMX Lab again and Alejandro Iñárritu developed this experience, a fundamentally location-based VR experience that represents the pinnacle of artistry for someone who's operating at the top of their game, creating a powerful narrative and immersive experience deliberately and intentionally for location-based VR. And again, this was another big signal for me to see this and to see the level of commitment and passion and drive that someone like Iñárritu put into this piece because he chose to. Again, this is not a marketing piece for another movie or another story he's trying to tell. This was the medium he chose to tell this story. And the combination of virtual reality and a physical location-based experience were the medium he chose. So the other thing about it is, and this occurred to me late because we focus a lot on IP and on these very dazzling experiences. Like the range of experiences represented in what I just showed you is pretty broad. You've got big recognizable IP, you've got shooting experiences, you've got narrative experiences, you have completely unheard of IP, you've got a range of different things and a different sort of experimentation going on. But of course, location-based experiences have been a staple of for instance, the film festival circuit for a long time. Chris Milk's Treachery of Sanctuary at Sundance, Hero, this past year at Sundance, Ink Story's Hero, literally and figuratively blew me away, and I still think about that experience on a regular basis, an intentionally physical experience. And Baobab's Jack that showed at Tribeca last time around are all examples of location-based experience in the sort of independent film circuit. But the bottom line is that we really feel that these types of experiences will represent a growing percentage of people's first time informative experience in VR. And the big question and the experiment we're embarking on and working on over the coming year and working on right now is to figure out how to connect those experiences to system sales, literally. But more particularly, we love the idea of an audience being able to go to a destination and have an experience and love that experience and continue that adventure at home. So this is something we're working really closely with a number of partners on how we can tie a location-based experience to an in-home experience. So interactivity is an interesting topic for storytellers, as you all know. We took some time to come up to speed. Game developers had a hot start in VR because the tools of creation were familiar and immediate to game developers. And the design language had a shallower learning curve than it did for narrative creators. As you know, I mentioned earlier, we're developing our vocabulary as we go. But we've reached this point in the evolution of the form where interactivity is fundamental to the experience. So I talked earlier about the fact that I'm a sucker for poetry. So I love this phrase. So there's a creative director, a game designer called Clint Hocking, and in 2007 he wrote a post, and the post was ostensibly about the game BioShock, and he was writing a critique of the game and talking about how the game promoted a theme of self-interest through its gameplay, while promoting an opposing theme of selflessness and kindness through its narrative. And he was saying this essentially violates the aesthetic distance that a player is supposed to have between the player and the game. And he coined this term ludonarrative dissonance, which people love to stay at conferences. Like the number of think pieces that have been written about ludonarrative dissonance is off the charts. But ludo being the root of the Latin word for game, and narrative dissonance. The reason I think it's important to talk about this is that I believe that this challenge is particularly relevant to VR creators in narrative, because that concept of distance that Clint talks about is insurmountable when you're in VR because you're in it. You're in it, it's around you, and you have, whether you like it or not, a role and a sense of agency, and if you don't, then you may be in for a frustrating experience, and you have a desire often to precipitate action in the narrative. So don't take it from me. So there's a couple of people that I hold in high regard who speak wisely about this. Ryan Kaufman is a narrative designer and a creative director, and he talks about the fact that at its core, filmmaking and the language of filmmaking is about having a sense of awareness of the viewer and using that awareness through editing and framing to tell a story. And he talks about the fact that narrative design is about having an awareness of the player within the story, and the need to have a pretty deep and technical skill set to build an immersive narrative experience around a player is very important. Then Katie Sharonis is also a narrative designer, formerly of Oculus, more recently, I believe, at Riot. And Katie has this, I think, really funny juxtaposition where she says people's idea of what narrative design is really about taking a detailed and grand idea and distilling it down but that it's like writing a novel. You've got a 90-hour experience burning inside you full of stories and characters and vistas and poetry. And the actual reality is you're using every trick in the book to say, hey, idiot, please click on this thing, because you need the user to precipitate the next action. So I've often heard game designers and narrative designers use different phrases to describe this, but essentially the issue is, on the one hand, you've got a quiver full of really subtle, nuanced tricks, that deep and technical skill set that Ryan talks about, to direct a user or a player through an experience in a way that makes them feel like they're the captain of that ship and they're the person making every decision, even if they're not. But every once in a while, you have to do what he described as using the frying pan method. So sometimes you just need to clock them on the head with a frying pan. And it's the equivalent of saying, like, I actually remember many times listening to Ryan talk about, we spent 3 hours on figuring out a narrative choice in the experience and used a number of nuanced and subtle things, and none of them were getting the desired result from the player. So eventually we just had to say, now you click on the red button, and just own the fact that sometimes you need to hit them in the head with a frying pan. Not frying pan related. I think Pete Billington is here, so he'll forgive me if I mangle any of this. But something I really love that the Fable team, who developed the experience, The Wolves and the Walls, based on Neil Gaiman's story, did was they realized that at the core of the experience they were building was an intelligent character to whom you play an imaginary friend, and you are responsible to her in different ways, and she is responsive and responsible to you. She needs you to do stuff, she needs you to solve puzzles, she needs you to make things happen, and she sometimes needs you to take things from her that you will need. So the team engaged an improv theater troupe called Third Rail in New York, and they performed the entire experience. And in these shots, Pete is playing the role of the user, or the camera, or whatever you want to call it. Pete is playing the role of the user, and the actress here is playing the role of Lucy. And they would role play every interaction in the game and try to basically sand the edges off the pieces that felt clunky, based on the skill of the improv team to react to the player in ways that felt natural. And one example is, at one point in the game, Lucy needs to hand you an object that you will need at a later point. It's a camera. And whenever I play a game and a non-player character gives me an important totem and is saying, and is letting you know, put this in your inventory, you're going to need it later, it breaks the suspension of disbelief for me pretty profoundly, because usually they really frying pan you. Like, they look you in the eye and they say, take this thing, you're going to need it later, let's move on. And it's jarring, and it also sometimes provokes behavior where you're like, well, what happens if I don't take it? What are you going to do then? And you don't want that. So what they found in this particular instance was they would experiment and iterate, and when the actress did not make eye contact with you when she handed you the object, you were infinitely more likely to accept the object from her. So it's a small example of, because that's what humans do, right? Humans don't look each other in the eye when they hand things to each other. They go, yeah, here you go. And I love that. I love the fact that the only way you could discover that is by using, an Elizabethan improv technique from hundreds of years ago, rather than, building that around code. So figuring out the role that agency plays for the player is hugely important, and I love this approach. I think it's very powerful, and improv and immersive theater is becoming more and more of a part, I think, of what a lot of developers are either using as a framing device to think about their development, or actually working with improv and immersive theater companies to build their experiences. So I don't want to suggest that passive experiences are just a thing of the past or are unwelcome, and I also don't suggest we write off video. I think there are a lot of interesting developments in video, especially in terms of quality, in terms of formats like 180, which are very interesting. But I do think with the ubiquity, the coming ubiquity of untethered headsets that have 6DoF capability, audiences are going to want something to do. So there will be a lean-back experience, and there will be passive experiences and stories. Passive stories that are told will always be important, but audiences want something to do, and agency is important, and building interactivity into our experiences is incumbent on us as developers. So what do I mean by tribal social behavior? I really love going to the movies. It's my favorite pastime. I love the whole experience. I love the entertainment format. Like I love the size and shape of a movie screen. Makes me happy. I love sitting in the theater. I love the popcorn. I love the Coke. I love all of it. But mostly, actually, I love the social aspect of it. Like I love the journey. I love the companionship. I love the arguing about the movie afterwards. But I'm in the minority. You know, it's not a secret that movie theater attendance and ticket sales are dwindling. It doesn't mean fewer movies are being made or fewer movies are being watched. Just not a lot of people are going to theaters. And my opinion about that is that the friction of that experience is too great for most people to endure in order to consume a passive experience, right? Because especially when most people feel like they can get a relatively decent approximation of that in their living room with their 72-inch screen and their surround sound, and the kitchen is right there and they can make their own popcorn. Most people feel that way, and most people don't have the yearning I have for the movie theater, and that maybe it's nostalgia or legacy feeling I have about it. So I think there's a lot of friction involved in movie theaters for people, so they don't want to go to them, they don't want to make that trek. But having said that, I think there are experiences that are emergent that do draw people out. And they draw very passionate, what I think of as tribes of people. I think of everything from, there's an amazing show called Pop-Up Magazine. Everything from something like Pop-Up Magazine to, Disney's Haunted Mansion that has so much depth and lore around it that it draws repeat viewers all the time, and usually in groups. People consume and revisit these experiences in groups, and I'm really interested in thinking about what is the VR equivalent of that experience? What is the VR equivalent of that social experience? Or how can VR augment existing social experiences? There are a ton of examples, few as probably well-known and as incredible as Punch Drunk Sleep No More, of immersive theater experiences where everything about it is about role play. The cast are playing a role. You, the attendee, the audience member, are playing a role, even though you're essentially an observer. You are choosing the timing and the speed and the depth at which you experience the narrative. And the environment plays a role. The rooms all play a different role. The props play a different role. But this is experiences like this. People don't go once. They'll go once and they'll go again, and they'll bring their friends, and they'll spread their passion about it in a viral sense to people they know. So 2-Bit Circus, the incredible team from Brent Bushnell, Eric Gradman, Nancy Bennett, have built this 40,000 square foot, I don't even know what to call it, like trippy arcade in downtown LA. And in their own words, they describe it as a living, breathing world that's tied together through communal gameplay. Secret quests, live actors, guests show up maybe just to play an arcade cabinet, but end up getting sucked into a narrative about the backstory of the park and its past. So this micro amusement park isn't just an arcade, it's this giant adventure game consisting of physical escape rooms, VR experiences, cocktail bars, karaoke, live improv. It's really incredible, and one of the sort of founding principles that the 2-Bit Circus guys talk about is that fun increases exponentially when shared with others. So these experiences are fun because they're fun. This is my team and I, or some of my team members and I, at the Palace Games escape room in the Presidio. So they're fun because they're great, and this is us at the Void. But they're also fun, or mainly fun, I would argue, because we did it together. And we learned things about one another. We played different roles. When we did the escape room, have you ever done an escape room? Everybody falls into a role. You know, usually I'm just like, I'll just sit here and take notes because I'm too dumb to figure out the puzzles. But I'm playing a role. You know, I'm contributing. But and it teaches you things about your friends and your family and the people around you. And it is the opposite of a passive experience. And they're mainly fun, as I said, because people are together. So social co-presence, as we call it, we often come up with these terms that feel very clear and distinct to us. We say social co-presence and it becomes a buzzword, and then I realize not everybody knows what that even means. But that idea of shared experience together and sharing in general are an integral part of these experiences, and we are really focused on how VR continues to play a meaningful role in those experiences and weaving this sort of viral, tribal, social aspect into everything we build with the developers we work with. Untethered headsets. As I mentioned, Oculus Go launched earlier this year. We talked about Oculus Quest today. I think they're game changers for users and for developers. And from a creator's perspective, they shift things in ways I found surprising. So getting rid of the wires. The most interesting aspect of it for me that should be obvious, but it took a while for me to realize the power of it for creators, is the impact of the unconstrained design space on developers. So there's a couple of examples here that I'll talk about. Actually, this is, first of all, just an illustration. So this just illustrates sort of the tracking volume for the hands or the extent of it. So if you think about what this means from a design perspective, the constraint that is naturally built in, even a completely immersive experience that has 360 degrees of, beautifully rendered detail all around you, still usually defaults towards a somewhat on-rails design, because the designer is thinking about where are the sensors positioned in the room, where's the cord, and they will usually present the puzzle or the narrative or whatever the subject matter is in this sort of 120 to 180 degree frame in front of the user. What you've got here now, and what designers are working with, is so long as your hands are in the radius of the frustum of this tracking volume, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You've got complete liberty to roam freely, depending on the amount of space you have, but also turn freely and present things in 360. And this is from a video we presented pretty early on what became Oculus Quest to sort of illustrate that, but something like Dead and Buried or Time Stall all are experiences that allow you to turn very, very freely. Eddie and the team at Functronic Labs in LA are building an experience we're working with them on. This is very much early development, work in progress, capture from the engine. But they're creating this alien world, and with the intent that you can roam freely and not think about just the object in front of you or addressing a specific object. It will become a detailed and rich alien world that allows you to explore and uncover the story and uncover the narrative at your own pace. And then there's Max and the team at Normal. Hi, Max. I know Max is here. Hey, man. So this is Max, and what I love about this idea is I initially was like, Max, send us a clip of that thing where you're rolling in the grass. And he's like, well, we don't have the grass thing anymore, but we are flying a hang glider. So the design of this particular action is unconstrained by worrying about where the sensors are in the room. So think about what that means for designing a narrative or designing an experience. It doesn't matter anymore how small the experience gets, how compact the user can get, or how large they can get and how big the gestures can get. It's all contained within the headset. And I think that is a game changer. Again, this clip from Half and Half, which is an experience Max and the Normal team are building, is early and work in progress, but we're super excited about all these titles. These are all titles we're targeting towards Quest. And then there's this. So for those of you who weren't at the keynote, let me play the trailer for VADER Immortal again.
There's something wrong, Captain. I need you in the cockpit now. That's impossible. Something's pulled us out of hyperspace.
You may wonder why I have brought you here.
So that last 2 seconds, whatever it was that you saw, was sort of the galvanizing moment for me with this project. We've been talking to Lucasfilm for quite some time about the VADER narrative experience that they were designing and developing. And what kicked it over the edge for me and made me realize that we absolutely have to do this and we have to figure out a way to bring it to the platform was the idea of lightsaber combat in untethered VR. So it's such a powerful idea of wish fulfillment. For me, maybe just me, that it became the aha moment for us about this project, that there is a deep and rich narrative to be explored, but man, at the moments where you can fire up that lightsaber and move freely around, it's incredibly special, and it really shows off the power of the technology and the experience. So yeah, all-in-one headsets are a game changer from a content creator's perspective, and I think we're at the beginning of this, and I'm constantly surprised by this, but expect, and I'm looking forward to being surprised by the innovative and incredible things that people do with the untethered form factor. Okay, so let me go back to this guy. Janice, one face looks to the future and one face looks to the past. And what we think about a lot and what consumes a lot of our planning and thought around supporting developers and working with developers is the idea that in the face of these disruptive factors, it's important to keep history in its appropriate context. So what I feel like I've certainly learned is that although film and traditional storytelling is this really important and relevant benchmark, this is a new medium in ways we didn't even expect it to be at the outset. And it's a new medium for a new age. And sort of chasing that prize of the redefinition of storytelling requires that we embrace these new elements, we embrace interactivity, embrace physical and location-based experiences, social design, and all-in-one headsets. And although a lot of our guidance to our developers is around that concept I mentioned earlier, that chaos should be a welcomed and an embraced tenet, it's also true that with great power comes great responsibility. And it's part of the theme of, if anyone saw Yelena and Isabel's talk earlier today, a lot of the theme and a lot of the things that we try to internalize is to think about what it means to create experiences for people and what are we putting out in the world, because with great power comes great responsibility. Also in technology, when you work in technology, we tend to get disproportionately enamored of the idea of disruption. And I do think it's also important to remember to avoid the churn, avoid the thrash, avoid the flavors of the month, and stay focused, stay true to what matters. So what I'll leave you with is the takeaways from this are, I love the way Michael Abrash talks about the future because he keeps it grounded in this sense of, here's what I think, but he said something this morning, like, it doesn't pay a prophet to be too specific. And I love the fact that he talks about his belief in the future, but his humility around what may or may not work. So these are 4 disruptive factors I talked about that I think are really going to mean a lot to us and to developers in the coming year and beyond. But there are 3 things particularly that I think about on a daily basis that I just wanted to share with you. And this is what it is. So as I said, it's important to know where you came from. It really matters. But the past is context, it's not a blueprint. The existence of and the adherence to that idea of a beginner's mind, I think, is really important. I think it's also important to be prepared to kill your sacred cows and to be open to exploration. We talk a lot about remembering the fundamentals and not getting distracted by shiny objects. If there's one quality I think about with the developers we work with and the creators we work with, and people hate it when I say this, and recruiters really hate it when I say it, but it's taste. It's really important to be tasteful and to do quality work and to think about, like, what am I going to do that's going to be meaningful and lasting? What's a shiny object? Well, a good example of that is what I mentioned earlier, that, right now, with the way this technology is moving and with the power that SIGSTOF brings and the advent of interactivity and the power of the tools that are at our disposal, I think passive storytelling is meaningful and important, but maybe better served on other platforms for the time being and in other media for the time being, because I think there is so much to be explored in the realm of interactivity. And last of all, I think it's important for us to remember to build with a sense of inclusion in mind, to embrace interdisciplinary diversity. It's something I've talked a lot about in the past that I didn't get into too much today, but blended teams and teams from different backgrounds, technical backgrounds, and creative backgrounds are vitally important to this medium. And it's important to be authentic and honest and find meaning in what we do, which seems obvious. So this shot means nothing except that I'm a sucker for a tracking shot. So I've been working at the intersection of art and science for 30 years. I'm lucky. And I have truthfully never been as excited about a technology in pairing and in partnership with creative expression as I am about the creative potential of VR right now. I think we're at this really interesting juncture, this interesting chapter. We've passed the cycle of outlandish hype, and we're in this really genuinely thrilling phase of experimentation and innovation. And so for me, like, that time is now for me. Like, this is the most exciting moment I feel like we've come across yet. And I'm really glad you could join us today, and cheers. Thank you.